Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on how Digitising BSS can grow EBIT by a whopping 30%. Really looking forward to talking to you about this with our panelists and presenters over the next hour. And talking of which, this is the group that we've compiled today. So my name is Chris Barraclough. I'll be hosting the session, and we've got presentations from Darius and Ria, consultants at STL Partners, and then Akhil Chamoko from CMO at MDS Global will join us for a Q&A afterwards. In terms of the agenda, I'll just spend a few minutes running through housekeeping, and then we'll start with the answer, the exciting stuff about the financial impact of Digitising BSS, and show you the impact it can have both on revenues and on costs. We'll then look at how that comes about, what are the core capabilities, what use cases are enabled by digital BSS, and then put that in context of more broadly the opportunities available for operators to play a bigger role within society and for their customers, and how digital BSS can support them in terms of being a strategic enabler before we move on to the Q&A session afterwards. So just looking at the housekeeping, you are in listen-only mode, so you aren't able to, we cannot hear you. If you need to get in touch with us, particularly if you've got audio problems or anything of that sort, there is a question and a chat box on the right in the panel. You can open and close that panel using the little orange arrow at the top there, which you can see with the letter number 1 next to it. Similarly, if you want to raise your hand to notify you've got problems, then you can hit the little hand button shown by the number 2. Please do, if questions arise, questions of clarity, where you want to challenge things, anything you want to know further, type that into the questions box on the right. You can explode that question box with the little arrow, type those in, and we will endeavour to get to those in the Q&A session. If we can't, we will certainly cover those afterwards with a written response to you, and we'll distribute that with the slides and the recording after the session. And feel free to share both the recording and the slides and the Q&A, or the answers to the questions, with your colleagues. And you can see we're on Twitter there. So hopefully that's all the housekeeping we need to go through. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Darius, who will then hopefully interest you with the numbers.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Chris. So as you mentioned, what we want to do is start with the answer. And as you will have seen from the title of this webinar, it's kind of how digital BSS and digitising your BSS can help you grow kind of enterprise EBIT by over 30%. So how do we actually arrive at this conclusion as STL Partners? And what we did was first take this operator X, where we're looking kind of based on an MNO or an MVNO in the business space, in a potentially a developed market like Western Europe, but also a competitive market with maybe 3 or 4 major players. And then again, looking at the mobile side, and we said, okay, well, what does a P&L look like for that operator X, that generic telco, that business? What does the revenue potentially look like in the enterprise space? But also, probably more importantly, to build the P&L, what do those cost layers look like? What does cost of goods sold look like? What does SG&A look like? What do our gross margins tend to be? If we then take away depreciation and amortization, what does our EBIT look like as a telco? And so we built a picture of that for this operator X for today, and we said, okay, well, in 3 years' time, what might that P&L look like if the operator stays on kind of current trajectory and current growth rate for the industry? And even though you might see a growth in enterprise customers and new customers coming on board, what you might also see is shrinking average revenue per account, shrinking ARPAs, leading to actually declining revenue growth. So what we've looked at in this chart on the left is in 3 years, what might the revenue line look like? What might the cost line look like? And what might the EBIT then look like? And it's coming out at around 10% for that EBIT margin, which we think is relatively fair for the telecoms industry. What we then did, and hopefully you can see from the chart on the right, is say, okay, well, if you do digitize your BSS, and we'll come on to what those use cases, specific use cases might be in a moment. If you do digitize your BSS, what might that profit and loss look like now? And what we should hopefully be able to draw your attention to is that red red bar, kind of the significant increase there from 144 million to 203 million, which in absolute terms is about an increase of 40%. But if you look at it in terms of a percentage of revenue, which I'm sure a few of you will, that's a growth from about 10% margin to 13.5. So that's that kind of 35% headline figure there as growth as a percentage of revenue for EBIT. And that's essentially driven by increasing that blue bar, the revenues, where we feel these use cases could grow revenues by about 4.5%. And we'll dive into that on the next slide as to where that revenue is really coming from. But also decreasing your cost per customer, your cost as a percentage of revenue, and some really kind of key cost metrics that are coming down and being reduced by digital BSS. And even though that yellow bar is actually increasing, your absolute costs have increased. That's because costs as a percentage of revenue are coming down, and there are some costs that you can't shift with digital BSS. So as you grow and scale the business, absolute cost looks like it's coming up, but the cost as a percentage revenue and cost per customer coming down significantly. So before we kind of dive into the revenue and cost lines and where some of those savings and increased revenues are coming from, just wanted to quickly run through a few more of the assumptions that we made when we were doing part of this modeling, just to get you familiar with the process. So essentially for this 3-year period, we've looked at growth as a kind of an S curve, and we've assumed this steady migration. So instead of kind of a big bang telco transformation project, we've looked at this as a steady implementation, and we think that's kind of reflecting what we're hearing in the industry about digital BSS, about telco cloud virtualization, where it's not about doing a big transformation project anymore. You have to be much more agile, DevOps, almost startup mentality. And so we tried to reflect that here in our migration curve, and showing kind of a steady implementation. The second thing is that we've modeled here the benefits and not necessarily the upfront costs. So we haven't looked at the upfront investment and ongoing investment for implementation. This model is focused primarily on the benefits that you can derive from these use cases. And what you might see as we go through is a few graphs that have kind of these 3 different scenarios. So we've modeled for the expected case, which is the graph that you see on the left. But we've also looked at, okay, well, if you were implementing these digital BSS use cases and you have slightly slower implementation or a slower migration of customers and partners onto that platform, what might that look like? And the flip side then with the high scenario, where you get much better adoption by the customers and partners, potentially more business units within the enterprise unit are actually using this platform, and there's good cross kind of team communication, etc. Because of course digital BSS doesn't just impact kind of IT. There's marketing, there's customer experience, there's potentially product and innovation. So there's a lot of different teams that can share in the benefits of digitizing BSS. So what we want to do on the next slide then is take you through kind of line by line where some of these benefits come from. And if we focus first on revenues and this growing kind of revenues by 4.5%, if we look at the high case, it could be up to kind of 5.4%, and in the lower case around 3.5%. But what I want to kind of point you towards first is that the shape of this curve doesn't follow that S that I mentioned, isn't that steady migration. And the reason for that is kind of what my second point on this slide is, that revenues are driven primarily by the increase in customer base, and as you increase and you grow kind of quarter on quarter, that growth accumulates, and that's what's leading to this shape of the revenues looking exponential in terms of their growth. And this increase in customer base comes from both the ability to acquire customers more effectively through capabilities like configure, price, quote, and what we've called automated service configuration and purchasing, which we'll come on to in a bit more detail in a moment. But also by reducing churn and creating a stickier proposition and better retention skills, means that you can quite significantly grow your customer base and therefore drive kind of core growth in core revenues. So you end up with that big blue bar on the right taking up quite the majority of the increase in revenue growth. But we've also looked at how these use cases could potentially improve upsell, whether that is through, again, the CPQ type capability, enabling customers to be more flexible and create their own bundles and buy more, or also kind of extracting data and analytics from the information or the data in the BSS systems, and being able to derive insight and better marketing, better up and cross sell opportunities coming from that. We've also looked at then the red bar, this idea that when you're acquiring customers more effectively and you do they do have the choice and flexibility to create their own bundles that, they are actually potentially buying more, and that first purchase could be significantly higher, so leading to an increase in ARPA and actually combating the decline that some telcos are seeing in that area. So that's kind of where some of the revenue growth comes from, and those buckets. If we then take a look at costs, what we saw is that in kind of cost of goods sold and sales general and admin, a reduction as a percentage of revenues of about 6.4% in SG&A and 4.7% for cost of goods sold. And that's quite significant for these cost metrics. And of course, there are ones that you can't impact. We mentioned we've kept depreciation and amortization as a pretty standard percentage of revenue. Network operations costs maybe aren't coming down because of these digital BSS use cases, but there are key KPIs and key cost measures that are coming down and driving this reduction of operational costs as a percentage of revenues. And we've modeled a few of those. So some of the key ones we've pulled out here: customer services. So that's kind of the big one with a reduction of 15.1%, and that's really coming from the ability to be zero touch and real time, and really reduce the burden, I guess, of things like call centers on having to manually provide information to customers on their billing and their usage. And so you can quite significantly reduce the burden of customer services there through kind of zero touch. Another key cost measure that we looked at was the cost of retention. So being much more effective in that process, and being able to, at end of life, make sure our customer stays without having to necessarily give too much away or bundle too many products or put in a lot of sales team effort to get them to stay. Being able to do that more effectively throughout the process and more digital and automated about that can lead to significant cost reductions of around 10.8%. And then another key cost measure, which I think is quite a big burden for telcos, and cost of acquisition, I think, tends to be somewhere between 5 and 10 times bigger than the cost of retention. So it is a big cost bucket, and fewer digital BSS use cases kind of touching on this area, but still a key part that can be impacted, and we're seeing about a 4.6% reduction by the end of year 3 in terms of cost of acquisition. And a few that we haven't put on this chart, but that we did model and we think BSS could impact things like bad debt and the cost of innovation, for example. So all these potential cost metrics being impacted, and we'll come on to the kind of specifics of the use cases and the metrics that they impact now. So we've talked a bit about these kind of headline figures and how digitizing BSS in inverted commas can drive this growth in EBIT. And when we're talking about this, what we're really talking about are these 5 use cases that we looked at and that we deep dived on, and kind of through the research kind of defined these as the key areas that telcos could look to digitize. And the first one that we looked at, quite a big one for BSS, is real-time billing management. And this was the capability where instead of a customer having to call a kind of customer services helpline to get kind of their customer data records and understand their bill and talk through their bill, you can do this in real time through some kind of portal, and then the customer can essentially access that information in a new way and can see it potentially broken down by cost center, by line of business, really drill down into their bill and the usage profiles to understand, where are certain costs coming from that they could potentially reduce, or where are things that they need to upsell. And that can have quite a significant impact in terms of stickiness, and that's why we feel in that impact to customers, you're reducing churn, both of your direct and potentially indirect customers. But that also has impacts to kind of cost and cash flow. So reducing kind of cost of retention with the stickier proposition and the ability to provide more insight and information to your customers on their usage. But also, I think the significant one that you saw, reducing that customer experience management cost and that cost of customer services, because you don't have that CDR pain point anymore. You can have the customer kind of finding their own information and moving towards a self-service model. But then also, if cash flow was something that you were struggling with, it's time to cash is also a potential benefit of this real-time billing management. So the second one that we looked at was automated service configuration and purchasing, and I think a few people might know that as part of CPQ and configure price quote. But this is essentially where the customer could log on to a portal and be able to pick and choose from your portfolio, the telco's portfolio, different products and services to create their own bundle, and then essentially that service, they can get a price for what that would cost. They can purchase that service and even automate the fulfillment of that. that obviously has an impact in your ability to acquire customers. That's not a very arduous process. And I think one of the key issues with digital can often be, how do you make that acquisition process as smooth as possible and increase your conversions there? And we think this use case is a key way to do that and acquire customers more effectively. That has an impact to costs in terms of cost per acquisition coming down. Also potentially, if customers are using the same portal at end of life, that could bring down your cost of retention, and of course bringing down kind of customer experience management costs as well. But can also be a use case to impact revenues, where, as I mentioned before, the ability to give the customer flexibility and choice can allow them to actually purchase more at the point of checkout, and that's kind of a finding that we've seen. So the third one then, I think this is really important, is this partner and wholesaler management. So telcos aren't going to sell in the enterprise space only direct, especially with the SMB market. There will be a large portion going through indirect channels and through resellers. And I probably don't have to tell you guys, but resellers can be extremely fickle and they can move to where they think they're going to get the best deal. So creating a stickier proposition with them is a great way to kind of keep them coming back to you as a value added kind of telco, and also then reduce churn of your indirect customer base. And so with a capability like partner wholesale management, where they can go on and see, I guess, more information about their own customers and how their customers are interacting with the telco services, and enable them to get more information and insight, which can often be kind of trapped within the telco, allowing them to see more of that and have visibility of that information can be quite sticky. And so we think that could have a significant impact to churn, but also enable you to kind of reduce costs at the same time. But again, retention coming up a lot, that customer experience management cost coming up, and also potentially your time to cash. And then the fourth one, I think this is quite an interesting use case, and one that telcos are pursuing, not just in terms of digital BSS, it's all about becoming a much more data-driven business, taking network data and turning it into insight. And the fact is, BSS will carry a lot of rich information on kind of usage profiles, user behavior, how they're interacting with your products. And so being able to turn that into insight and actionable insight and recommendations will allow you to understand more about your customer, reduce their churn, potentially acquire new customers because you know more about what certain types of customer or customer segments are looking for. That more effective marketing can obviously increase your cross and upsell opportunities. But then, being more effective at that can also reduce your key cost metrics. And this is where, I mentioned the potential cost of innovation. And, if you can feed this data into product development roadmaps and the product development in general, then essentially you could potentially reduce that cost of innovating new services and product development. And the last one that we looked at, zero touch end user account management. This one's much more focused on, I guess, the in-life support and being able for the customer being able to log on to, again, a self-service portal and change things about their services, whether that's adding new users, verifying users, putting in usage limits, for example. It's giving them a lot of power to define how their account is managed, essentially. And that, again, creating a very sticky proposition to reduce that churn and cut those kind of traditional CPR, CXM costs. But here again, being able to potentially cut bad debt. And bad debt, I think around maybe 1 or 2% for most telcos. And so, not a huge cost line, but I think, a key point to make here is that a lot of these are about making kind of small marginal changes to these big KPIs. It's not, one use case affecting one KPI and making a huge and drastic change. It's this marginal changes, which when you take them as a whole, lead to significant benefits to the bottom line. And I think that's quite a key point to make when you're thinking about this, is there's a lot that you can do which when you aggregate will have a significant impact. So I think now we'll hand over back to Chris to take you through a quick poll.
Thanks, Darius. So Darius went through the 5 use cases that we have modeled. And what we'd like to ask you is, which of these use cases that he outlined do you think would have the most significant impact on your business, or are having the most significant impact if you are implementing a digital BSS solution? And what I would just remind, we've had a couple of questions about this. Are we talking about B2C or B2B? And what we have modeled is very much a B2B perspective. So we're looking at the enterprise channel, enterprise accounts, and resellers into that enterprise unit. So that's worth just to ensure we're all comparing like with like in terms of the way we answer this. So any more for any more, and then I will be able to. Let me just share that with you. So there are the results. Any quick comments on that, Darius, before we move on?
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting result, and I think on the next slide, Ria will be able to take you through a little bit about what we found when we did some of this research ourselves. So thanks everyone for filling in the responses, and I'll hand over to Ria.
Oh, great, thanks, Darius. These results are actually very much in line with the modelling exercise that we've done, but it's interesting for us to see these results because we also conducted this survey with industry executives and asked them to select a first and second choice out of these 5 use cases for where they thought that digitising BSS would create the most value for them. And as you can see, real-time billing management came out as the most popular and always as a first choice when selected. But the most popular second choice was automated service configuration, which is obviously more in line with the modelling that we've done and with your responses. But it's obviously interesting when we look at the impact that each of these could have on telco bottom lines, according to our modelling, where automated service configuration is likely to have the most significant increase on EBIT. And that does also seem to hold a fair amount of perceived value based on the survey respondents. So this use case, as Darius has said, will have a big impact on cost of acquisition and operational costs, and can increase telco revenues with more new customer acquisitions and reduce churn, offering these new and dynamic product configurations with a higher cross-sell potential. But customer analytics is also likely to have a more significant impact than real-time billing management, which was the most popular from our survey respondents. And real-time billing management does have the potential to significantly reduce operational costs, as customers will be less reliant on call centres and can also reduce churn of direct and indirect customers, as Darius has already mentioned. But with customer analytics, not only can telcos improve customer experience, but they'll also be automating what is currently a very manual process. And so we'll have a big impact on a number of other key metrics, obviously churn with improved customer experience, but also these cross-sell and upsell opportunities, all done at a much lower cost to the telco. So automated service configuration and customer analytics came out on top in our modelling, as they will have bigger impacts on telco gross margins through both increasing revenues, but also reducing cost of goods sold, and then also reduce SG&A. But it is interesting that real-time billing management was selected, and it suggests that there is a lot of perceived potential for that use case and being able to reduce operational costs and customer churn. So we also wanted to provide a bit of context on what all of this means in terms of the bigger picture for telcos in addressing some of the key challenges facing the industry. And the core point is that by implementing these use cases that we've gone through and providing a more seamless and personalised and zero-touch end-user experience, telcos will be in a much stronger position to engage with new opportunities for revenue growth and leverage new technologies that will allow them to achieve this. So to give some background as to why they'll need to focus their efforts on finding these new strategies for revenue growth is that, as mentioned, they are seeing shrinking revenue, primarily from the commoditization of their core function, that being connectivity. And then in addition, there are a number of social, economic and environmental changes that are shaping enterprise and consumer demands and expectations. And that marks this new age of technology that we call the coordination age. And these different ages that we'll go on to outline will impact telcos' functions and should influence their strategies. So a couple of centuries ago, as you can see, the core function of telecommunications was as simple as enabling connection between people. And this grew to being able to connect over long distances and overcome geographic boundaries. But eventually, once this becomes easily accessible to more and more people, it becomes a commodity. And other social and economic drivers ultimately changed customer expectations, and they sought new ways of being connected. And so, as you can see, we moved into the next stage of technology, the information age, where initially through the PC, people were able to connect to computers, and obviously the way that people interact with computers and the way that they expect to interact has massively changed even over the last decade. Through social media platforms and the expanding capabilities of mobile devices, customers assume instant access to information and to services, entertainment, retail, and much more. I mean, there are so many different ways that we use our phones now that we didn't even going back 5 or 10 years. And also born out of this age are the big internet players. So obviously Amazon and Google and Facebook, who do present telcos with strong competition as they are dominating in the B2B space in particular, but also in the B2B to C or X space. They have appealing business models that offer lots of free basic services, but then also a lot of optional premium services that are, as we can see, hugely profitable. And so they adopt this very effective kind of freemium model. And on top of this, yes, there's 5G, and telecoms operators are only providing better and better connectivity, faster and more reliable. But this isn't a novelty anymore. It's what's expected. And so on top of this, there are also these big challenges economically and environmentally. We're seeing an increasing strain on resources. And by that, I mean natural resources, but also basic services like healthcare. Even pre-COVID, there were global concerns on the ability of sectors like healthcare to keep up with rapidly increasing population sizes and even globally increasingly aging populations, whilst also wanting to ensure that ideally all of their population can be served with high quality healthcare at a relatively low cost. And this is where we see the market moving firmly into this new age of technology, which we call the coordination age. And this is all about coordinating relevant parties in the most efficient way possible. It's not just about connecting people to people or to computers, but also connecting things like machines and buildings, and having greater automation to free up human resources where needed, and generally improve and optimize processes to make the most efficient use of resources. So what does this mean for telcos? Well, yes, on the one hand, the commoditization of connectivity is a big challenge for telcos, but there is also an opportunity for them to position themselves as key enablers for this new level of coordination. And a starting point will be to digitize their BSS systems and make sure that before they start to explore how they can engage in more dynamic business models and offer new propositions to enterprise customers, that they're in a strong position to handle this change in an agile, efficient, and where possible, automated way. And so, as you can see on the next slide, once telcos have achieved this, they'll be in a stronger position to leverage emerging technologies that promise to deliver on these core telco objectives. So we've identified 3 emerging technology trends that are currently making big promises for telcos in terms of expanding and enhancing their existing service offerings and capabilities. So firstly, as you can see, there's 5G. And as I've already mentioned, whilst it's brilliant that telcos will be offering consumers faster, more reliable, and just on the whole, better connectivity, that will not be the strong selling point or the novelty that it used to be. What 5G does offer telcos is the opportunity to enable new and more dynamic use cases to expand their addressable market, particularly with enterprise customers, and offer them more attractive propositions. And a really key one is obviously IoT, where there's vast amounts of data, often data that needs to be secure if we think about the healthcare sector, for example. And it requires this data to travel from one place to another quickly and reliably in order to enable the basic functioning of often mission critical applications and even more autonomous functions. And the key thing here is that, as is shaping the coordinate more broadly, as we call it, as industries strive for their resource and process efficiency, this notion of connecting things will only become more compelling. And if telcos leverage this opportunity, they will be able to play higher up the value chain and find new sources for revenue growth. And the other core trend that we are seeing is edge and edge cloud. Obviously, there's been a lot of hype around the cloud with its flexibility and scalability. And then when you move this out to the edge, there are added benefits around latency and higher bandwidth, and really key in some industries, as I've already mentioned, data localization. So again, there's this opportunity for telcos to play higher up the value chain, but also to leverage their own infrastructure, particularly for edge, to compete with some of these big internet players and the hyperscale cloud providers who are currently dominating this space with really strong customer propositions that they're only building. And then finally, and perhaps most directly relevant to BSS, is this whole idea of automation and AI. On the one hand, telcos should be looking to optimize and automate their internal processes as much as possible. And we see this with some of the BSS use cases that we've already mentioned. But they can then also extend this and offer this automation capability to other telcos. And once telcos have automated their backend systems and made optimal use of the vast amount of customer data that they possess to offer personalized and just really strong customer service, they'll be in a much stronger position to deliver on the promises held by these emerging technologies that we've mentioned, and their B2B proposition as a whole will be much stronger from end to end and make it easier for them to compete with the hyperscalers. So they have to leverage their reputation as trusted providers of connectivity as a starting point, as that's their core selling point. So thank you. I think now I will hand over to Chris for Q&A.
Great, thanks Darius, thanks Ria. That's really good presentations. What I'd like to do is introduce Akhil again, who's going to join us for the discussion. And Akhil, maybe I can kick off because you obviously work for MDS and you are on a day-to-day basis supporting your telco customers and implementing these kind of solutions. We assumed here that there was a very much a sort of incremental and gradual implementation of digital BSS. Is that correct, or more going for a big bang approach? What is the typical sort of implementation models you're seeing for moving from more of an analog to a digital BSS solution or system?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think operators have been going through digital transformation for many years at the moment, and I don't think that's ever going to change. The digital transformation is always going to be a project, I think, in operators. But there are some aspects of transformation which are just becoming really high cost, and that's the ongoing transformation of BSS. And the way we sort of approach it is, you are in a competitive market. The market is already moving, and if you fall behind on these kind of transformations, effectively it's going to cost you more than the cost of actually the BSS in the first place. So we've always approached our analysis of saying, look, why don't you stand up something ready to go, so you're attacking this new business opportunities that Ria and Darius have talked about. Okay, get engaged with your market in a far more digital way, so it's sticky. Be prepared for the 5G environment where you need to be co-creating better with business creators who are creating effectively the business drivers that require your service. Get ready first, launch from there first, and then slowly migrate your existing or legacy businesses bit by bit to this environment. And the transformation is not really about technology. It's also about cultural change within the business. And when you've got so many elements to move, making change around culture is very, very difficult. When you've got an environment, a technical environment, let's say, which is stood up and automatically forces a culture to work around it, then you hopefully will see that you get there a lot quicker.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's interesting. We've had a few questions about why the selection of the specific use cases we came up with, and obviously automated service configuration and purchasing came out pretty strongly, both in the responses we had today and then more generally in our research. What was the driver of those five, and do you think we've covered most of the value creation, or are there things missing?
I mean, those five is what we see from our existing customers as the next steps that they're taking, but also in RFPs and RFIs. And I think a lot of that is stemmed around the business case in the first place, and it's not only the future, it's also the current. A lot of the operators we see or engage with at the moment are trying to tackle the SME market. It's been known or agreed that it's it's not very well served at all. And compared to the MLE market, the medium to large enterprise market, where because their accounts are so much bigger, an operator can afford the inefficiencies of creating personalized plans and services and packages to support large accounts. But in the SMEs, where they want the same level of personalization, it's just not economically possible, and operators tend to use resellers to get around and sort of get to that market. So to approach the SME market, which, if you look at it across Europe, 98% of businesses are SMEs. To get into the market, they feel as if having those 5 use cases is the way that they can automate, become more efficient, and get access to the market, so people can self-configure the packages. They have the ability to look after it. And the reason why it's more complicated than B2C is you're dealing with multiple stakeholders. You'll have a financial controller, let's say, within that sort of enterprise. You will have end users who are their employees, who are reliant on the service for productivity. They can't be cut off if financial restrictions or credits are broken. So to be able to provide that control to the SMEs in a very personalized way is critical for them to do business with them. And therefore, that is actually driving the immediate demand today for engagement with that market, but also as it goes into the 5G and IoT market, where there's a lot more co-creation going to be happening, a lot more working with business creators on around their requirements for an IoT project with multiple parties, and then using that sort of virtualized infrastructure to deliver it. It's just going to exacerbate what they need today for the SME market.
We've had a few questions directed at Darius and Ria about the nature of the research, and I guess the question is really driving at the credibility here. Was this a case of locking yourselves in a dark room and coming up with some ideas and then putting some numbers to them, or was there primary research done? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. So this was kind of what we'd done was primary research to get to these numbers. It was working to understand, okay, well, are these use cases, the key ones? And the survey information that Ria showed and highlighted was trying to assess, okay, well, what is the potential value of these use cases? And what the part of that survey was, what are the metrics that they do impact? So when we're saying, and we went through that table of, okay, well, real-time billing management, it can impact this metric, this metric, this metric. That came from this survey where customers, end users were saying, and telcos were saying, okay, well, this is what we think the impact of that metric could be. This is how we've been implementing it, and we think this could be the level of value. So we then, okay, well, let's take those survey responses and build how we think the model could look, and then we validated that through conversations with telcos directly to say, okay, well, look, we've built this for an operator X. Does that kind of make sense as a base case, and does this make sense as a forecast? And do these metrics on their own look like the order of magnitude that you would expect at maturity to get with this kind of capability, and trying to assess, okay, well, has this telco's implemented this capability? What kind of ROI have they seen? And trying to build that then into the model, and when we aggregated it together, showing the output that you get, which is the kind of 35% increase. So a bit of both in terms of the discussion, the interview, but also trying to use a survey to get some quant information. So hopefully it should reflect a cautious but also realistic output.
Okay, thanks. And I guess picking up on that point, we've had a question from Rajiv, which is, I guess probably more directed at you, Akhil, which is, can you share any examples of implemented actual revenue and cost improvements that have been achieved? I mean, clearly we're not asking you to reveal your clients or what they've been done, and what we've done here in terms of the model we've built has been pretty much a sort of soup to nuts, assuming you did everything over that period of time, and at the end of 3 years what you get to. You've presumably, a number of the projects you've had have been on particular areas. Maybe you can give a little bit of examples of what those areas have been and the kind of benefits that clients have achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think all our operators have implemented all of those use cases. They're taking them on board bit by bit. And maybe one example is one of our customers has got a very large network of resellers, and in the past, for their resellers to serve their customers whenever they had an inquiry about a bill or a ticket or whatever item, it becomes a two-stage process. The reseller gets the inquiry, they try and figure it out, they need some real-time information, or they need even detailed information that is not available to hand because they have no automated system. They then sort of call the back-end operator, and it goes through a very lengthy process of trying to resolve a customer's any customer's question. And just from having a reseller portal that they can go into, which has real-time information about the customer accounts, the situation about maybe some of the end users, so it changes the conversation straight away. It's immediate response on the phone. This is why this happened. Or do you want to change that? And we can make some improvements. So just supporting the resellers and partners had a significant cost reduction for the operator, but also had a significant cost reduction on what it cost a reseller to sell the product, and they could earn higher commissions out of it too. So it had a cascade effect all the way through the chain. That's just one example.
And any more to add to that in different areas that you've come across, and the kind of orders of magnitude in terms of benefits that customers are realizing as a result of this?
Yeah, I mean the other one is interesting. You had real time because I think number one required we see is the real time need, and the reason why is a lot of these operators are also trying to go direct to the market. They obviously have the resellers, but be able to go direct obviously removes one margin or one mouth of feed in the process. But the real-time elements, what we found from one of our customers operated at, immediately gives what their customers have been asking for is, number one, is real-time financial control over their accounts. Okay, so they have maybe 100 employees which are using this account, and all of a sudden 2 or 3 rogue employees, through no fault of their own maybe, have completely smashed the credit limits on that account. And to stop the financial controller sort of cutting off the users or requesting, at least they can dive in straight away, make some rational decisions and decide how to extend and manage the situation better. Which is why real time actually has been number one in terms of some of the RFIs we've seen, and some of the deployments we're doing right now. But it's because there's some tangible benefits straight away in the self-care that they provide to the end customers.
Question here around personalized offers and whether we included the notion of being able to market personalized offers based on subscriber usage, account usage, and the degree to which that was modeled and the importance that had on the revenue growth numbers. Any comments on that? And well, first of all, did we include that as an offer, the sort of marketing and personalization capability as a result of digitizing BSS systems, and how important was that in our model?
Yeah, so I can take this one as well. So in short, yes, it was included. And when we think about customer analytics and being able to extract some of the rich data that's coming through BSS and beyond BSS as well, telcos are doing this in the network, and some operators that are quite successful, like Elisa, Telenor, Telefonica, very good data management capabilities, and their ability to then personalize and do next best action marketing and recommendations, etc. Is a key part of moving towards digital, and one of the key benefits that you can derive in digital with this data management capability. So yes, it was included, and it's a very significant part of that customer analytics piece, and it's probably one of the main drivers for why when Ria was talking through it on the use case level kind of metrics graph slide, why that was coming up so high, and why that and automated service configuration and purchasing seem like they have the strongest impact. It's because of that data-driven data capability that enables you to know more about your customer and do that level of personalization and tailoring, so they see what only what they want rather than a load of stuff that they don't necessarily need.
Got it. We've had a question. It's been mentioned a couple of times that this is a continuous journey, this notion of digitizing and developing a more automated business. And the question was, how, where in the current process are operators in the digitization and cloudification of their BSS? And then as a follow-up to that, what were the assumptions we used for the base case of the company that we were modeling? Where were they? Were they right at the beginning? Was there an assumption they were partway through? So where is the market? Does that vary regionally? And then what were our assumptions in terms of building the model?
Maybe take the first part there, Chris, if you
Sure.
want. I think, generally, the operators have done sort of a lot of work around the B2C segment. They've applied a lot of these technologies in the B2C environment. There's loads of operators with self-care and real-time updates to customers and next best actions for sure. But the B2C, so the B2B market or the B2B2X market has generally been a sort of second cousin, really, to adopt this. And with 5G and IoT sort of coming along, where there's a lot more focus on the enterprise era, there is now an attention to the B2B market and what it takes to improve that customer experience with enterprises. And I think that we are very much at the beginning of that. I mean, you try and find there's only a handful of operators who today even provide you sort of real-time control or account management. So, I think we're sort of at very much of the beginning of the process there, and I think the 5G IoT has a large bearing on the kind of investments operators are going to make going forward.
And Ria, Darius, in terms of how we reflected that in our model, were there specific assumptions around what the nature of the operator were doing? And I guess one of the things also is that this must vary quite significantly regionally. There must be some regions, more mature markets, that are probably a little bit further ahead. And what were our assumptions on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And when you are building a model that is kind of operator X for a generic operator, it's quite hard because, like you say, there are different telcos in different regions at very different stages. But we kind of, I think, take a similar view to Akil, where in B2B, there's been less work done and making sure those systems are in place and have been cloudified and are ready to deliver these business models. I think that's been a much slower process, and I think it probably goes hand in hand with what we've seen around a slightly slower move, especially in Europe, around the move to telco cloud and virtualization. When we've been doing research on digital e-commerce, a lot of telcos have been trying to make progress there in that consumer space, but there's back-end systems that need to be overhauled, and that's difficult as an established or legacy telco, where there's a lot of work to do on the tech side, but also on the cultural side, and then trying to make those changes. So when we were looking at this in terms of the 5 use cases, we kind of assumed that the telco was on the current trajectory that we've seen, where they've maybe been a bit slow and haven't implemented any of those use cases yet, and then throughout the course of that 3-year period start to do that migration. So I think in the model it's kind of assumed that the operator doesn't have a very strong kind of cloudified BSS system at the moment, and is moving from maybe a slightly more legacy version to the kind of new swanky model.
Thanks. And Ria, you were talking a little bit more about this future sort of coordination age and what that could look like and what is going to happen. This digitized BSS, is that something that's required for telcos if they want to remain as connectivity players in terms of providing network as a service? Or do you see it as also important if they want to move beyond that into providing enablement platforms or vertical solutions? And is it, regardless of where they want to play,
it's something that is an inevitability? They get left behind if they can't do that.
Yeah, I think so, because I think that the key point is that telcos will need to move beyond connectivity. And when we're talking about the coordination age, in terms of key players in the coordination age, there's not just going to be one player who dominates, but the point is that there are going to kind of be these multiple parties kind of coordinating these different industries, and that's really an opportunity for telcos to leverage these new technologies that are going to enable new kinds of business models. And in order to be able to handle those new and more dynamic business models and engage enterprise customers in often different ways, they will need to have, as Darius has said, the strongest and most automated backend systems to be able to handle that. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, and I guess put simply, in the past, telcos had to worry about the metered minute or the metered megabyte, and then actually more recently, it's almost become easier on the BSS systems and billing systems to some extent, in that it's been flat rate and you've been charging per customer a subscription. But going forward with multiple parties in these complex ecosystems and value being distributed, as we've seen, with the internet players to developers, to those who manage the billing and rating, the distribution. There are lots of players. To some extent, you need a flexible system that's able to rate and manage the distribution of value across lots of different players. So I suppose going forward, in a sense, in recent past, it's got in some ways easier for telcos, but going forward, where they're looking at, it's going to get a lot more complex than it has been. The last question before we wrap up was a question about what do the numbers look like if you include the investment and ongoing costs in a new BSS system, and we didn't do that. We just looked at the upside. So it's a fair question, and I guess I'm not going to put you on the spot and say what do the numbers look like if you had included them, but I guess the follow-up question is, how could the work here be used and developed going forward in terms of providing additional value to operator customers? What's the option here to include that in a more formal business case, and how might that happen? Any thoughts on that?
I can add to that, maybe, Chris.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the work that you guys done and I've seen, is a great platform actually that allows us to maybe provide a more granular ROI analysis for operators. Obviously, we've taken, you guys have taken a set of base assumptions behind the analysis, but I'm pretty sure that when we go into real operators, and we have this time and time again when we engage with operators and we put up an ROI model, they will never sort of trust a vendor, let's say, on the ROIs. But independently, your model could be taken and as a starting point in operator discussions, and says, well, give me your baseline figures, or give me where your baseline sort of is at the moment, and remodel that and probably give a more accurate reflection of the return on investment they may get by taking out these particular exercises.
Okay, and I think that just to add on that, I think the model is built in such a way that there's this kind of key input assumptions for that base case, where it's kind of like this is the expected kind of monthly churn, this is the expected growth in customers. Those inputs can be quite easily tweaked and changed based on the telco, but I think the main thing that would be beneficial going forward is saying, okay, well, you as an operator, we spoke to a few that had already had a kind of CPQ type capability. So it's saying, okay, well, in this model, how can we remove that and only show you if you were to implement those four use cases, and then what would the cost be attributed to that? So I think that's kind of one thing that we could build in as a cost lever, as well as a revenue and benefits lever, to say, okay, well, how does this tweak and fit for not just an operator X, but to build ROI for you as an individual operator.
Thanks. That's really useful. I think it just falls to me to say thank you for your time in terms of listening as an audience, and thank you to our panelists and presenters. And just by way of sort of next steps, obviously these presentations and the discussion we've had have been drawn on a detailed report that sort of has a lot more information about the research. You can download that from the STL Partners or MDS Global website. When we send out this presentation, as we will surely do today or tomorrow, we'll include a link to that. We are undertaking ongoing research around BSS, and we've got interview programs. The question was around, the current cloudification process and digitization of BSS. Those kind of topics are some of the things that we're discussing in that. And again, if you'd like to participate in that, please do get in touch with us. But just to fulsomely say thank you very much, and look forward to joining you on the next webinar soon. Bye now.
Thank you.